Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Well, I am very excited about our guest today. He is a star in the field of transhumanism and life extension, which are favorite subjects of mine. It's Gennady Stolyarov II is chairman of the US Transhumanist Party, an author, actuary, philosopher, composer, poet, and futurist. He's also editor-in-chief of the Rational Argumentator. Welcome, Gennady. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Scott. And William, I'm pleased to be here speaking with you today.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very interested in your story growing up. Just as a very brief anecdote, I started fearing death when I was probably 12 years old. My mother took me to a therapist about it. I was explaining it, and the therapist was like, well, so, just going through the questions, are you considering harming yourself? And I'm like, no, it's the opposite of that, And so just part of it is just realizing that, the adults around you don't have answers for it either. I think that was shaping, but I'm interested in your history, how you, had those experiences, how you got into Ayn Rand, and how you got into transhumanism ultimately.
Yes, and I will say that for most children, my impression is the initial reaction when they learn about death and about human mortality, how up until this time it has been inescapable, that reaction is one of revulsion, one of a sense that this is an injustice, that
Right.
people should not be faced with this kind of end if they did nothing wrong. And yet, by the time far too many people become adults, they even forget what it was like to experience that initial reaction. And they may not even be able to identify with a child or a teenager, in your case, who expresses it in a very direct manner. For me, this experience happened even earlier than you described. And I write about this experience in Death is Wrong, which is my illustrated children's book on life extension. So I was fascinated with numbers very early on in my life. I learned how to count when I was 2. I learned how to read when I was 3. By the time I was 4, I was exploring very large numbers like a Google. And I kept asking adults, essentially, well, what happens later and later in life? And I had this conversation with my mother, essentially, about what happens when people get older. And I got some of the typical responses. They grow up, they go to school, they go to college, they start a family, they have a career, they retire. And then what? And I got this answer, and then they die. And I was wondering, well, what is that? And I wasn't raised in a religious setting, so the answer was people stop existing when they die. And to me, that was just such an appalling possibility to contemplate, because it meant the destruction of everything, the end of any sort of awareness, any sort of experience, any sort of potential for
Even
acquiring knowledge.
Existence.
Right. So even whatever one has done, one would not remember. And that great travesty is one that I've never been able to accept, no matter what attempts to console me or allege that this is inevitable, but it's far away, so you don't have to worry about it. No matter which of these attempts were made, I could not reconcile myself with human mortality. So when I was 5 years old, I remember visiting the botanical gardens in Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, where I was born, and just seeing the beauty of that spring day and all of the vivid colors, textures. I saw the swans swimming in the lake. And I was thinking, how could it be that all of this could just be gone completely without even a memory of having experienced it?
Right.
And I realized death is just unacceptable. I need to dedicate my life to the struggle against death. So this was my intuition as a 5-year-old. Of course, it took me some time to figure out, how do I approach this problem besides just wanting for there to be a solution. It seemed clear to me that medical technology needed to progress far beyond its current capabilities in order for us to reach that kind of world. But I wasn't entirely certain of the timeframes in which this would happen when I was a child, and all of the cultural signaling that I encountered suggested, even among people who thought this was a decent idea, that it would take centuries to do that.
Right.
Now, in the meantime, I was studying literature, philosophy, art, music. I came across the writings of Ayn Rand in 2001, and I read essentially all of her fiction works and most of her nonfiction works in the summer of 2001. And then I read the remaining ones that I could access at the time in the ensuing 2 years or so. And for me, Ayn Rand articulated a vision of achievement and of the ability of the individual, the heroic individual, to really make a difference in a particular field, and the value of doing that, which had been neglected by mainstream culture. And to me, that seemed to be quite an integral component of future human progress. In my view, we had to embrace this vision of individualistic creators, and each one of us could be an individualistic creator who could move forward a particular field of endeavor, because that is good for the self. And not only is it good for the self, but what is good for the self is also good for everybody else when everyone's rational self-interests are considered. So the idea that the interests of the self, when properly seen in a prudent and long-term way, actually align with the interests of everyone else. And you don't have to sacrifice anybody to anybody else. That was a pivotal idea for me. Again, it seemed quite contrary to dominant cultural narratives. Dominant cultural narratives were those of conflict, of groups of people pitted against one another based on their identities, based on their socioeconomic status, or how much power they had or didn't have. And I realized it doesn't need to be this way. There are paths forward where everybody's interests can be aligned, and my interest is not bad to pursue in any way, and it doesn't have to impinge upon anybody else's legitimate interests. So I got into the political aspects of objectivism as well, and related currents like libertarianism. I know Ayn Rand wouldn't have considered herself to be a libertarian, but she inspired a lot of libertarians.
True.
And I was interested in how political systems could be reformed in order to achieve this maximal progress, the maximal freedom of individualist creators to develop new technologies, new works of art and literature and institutional innovations. And for the next 3 years, essentially, that was predominantly what I was focused on. Now, I was a student at the time, and so this was my passion on the side, but I probably devoted 9 to 10 times the effort to it that I did to my studies. And keep in mind, I was valedictorian of my high school, salutatorian in college, but I learned so much more by delving into these ideas and studying them autonomously and seeking to apply them. But I still had this idea in the back of my mind that all of this innovation and progress, if we were to unleash it, would improve our standards of living and would improve our length of life, but to extend it indefinitely would still take a few centuries. And that changed in 2004 when I encountered the work of Dr. Aubrey de Grey, who was the originator of the concept of SENS, strategies for engineered negligible senescence. And he pointed out, essentially, that there was an easier way than the commonly posited approach of altering the human metabolism to age slower, which is very difficult to do because metabolism is exceptionally complex. It may take us centuries to understand it fully to the level we would need to manipulate it. But there was a different approach, which was the engineering approach, to find the various types of damage that accumulate in the body with time and eliminate the damage, return the cells and the components of the cells to their previous state, their biologically younger state, without altering the rate at which the new damage accumulates. So you could have a rejuvenation therapy when you're biologically 60, and it would turn you into a biological 40-year-old, and it wouldn't make you indestructible. It wouldn't necessarily remove all of the problems that an older body has, but it would buy you time. And in the next 20 years, you would still age, but by the time you become a biological 60-year-old again, you would have access to the next generation of therapies. And that generation of therapies will be even more effective and more reliable. So if you can reach the first rejuvenation therapies, chances are you'll be able to get to a state of longevity escape velocity where every additional year that passes, you actually can gain more than a year of remaining life expectancy. And Aubrey de Grey made a convincing argument at that time in 2004 that there was about a 50% probability that longevity escape velocity was 30 years away. And his most recent time frame in 2021, keeping in mind both the advances that have happened during that time, as well as some of the disappointments. There were periods of insufficient funding, though perhaps now that problem is remedied or largely remedied. He now projects a 50% probability that longevity escape velocity will be within reach in 15 years, so by 2036. So I think the chances of our generation reaching it are quite good. And of course, for somebody who originally had a less optimistic outlook, this was a life-changing type of realization that within my lifetime, I could actually see the benefits of an open-ended lifespan. And then I was thinking, again, for many years, what can I do as an individual to make a contribution to this field to materially affect the probability of these breakthroughs happening in time for me? And for many years, I wrote articles, I created videos, I donated to organizations that funded this kind of research. But I kept wondering, well, what could I do uniquely? How could I leverage my own talents in ways that haven't been done before that could perhaps remove some of the roadblocks to that field? And my first breakthrough of that scale was Death is Wrong, the illustrated children's book on indefinite life extension, which was published in 2013. And it did make the rounds in at least certain media outlets. And after that, I think that paved the way for me to become the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party in 2016, and I've held that role now for nearly 5 years. And I'll be happy to get into that further, but this is essentially how I became involved in transhumanism and the life extension movement. And now I have been engaged in some manner of life extension advocacy for 17 years.
That's a great story. I can't imagine a nobler goal to pursue. I'm curious, just, when I hear transhumanism, I mean, I've been into the life extension movement. I see that as the broader term. And then transhumanism, I used to see as a kind of just subset that involved either like the hope of, either downloading our identity or merging with machines or something in those areas. And I think that that's somewhat part of the transhumanist party, but it also seems to kind of intermix any life extension technologies as well, and will support any that show promise.
So I would say actually the classifications would be reversed. So transhumanism is the broader term, and it encompasses life extension. It also encompasses a variety of other technological pursuits, and these could include cybernetic enhancements. It could include the pursuit of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, automation, and other technologies as well that don't directly extend lifespan, but could improve the quality of life or the reach of the human species. Space colonization is an example. Vertical farming, seasteading is another example. And I know there are various objectivists and certainly a lot of libertarians who are interested in seasteading. So transhumanism is not a specific set of technologies. It is a philosophy. It is a worldview that advocates for the open-ended improvement of the human condition through science and technology. And so any technologies that are conducive to that aim could be embraced by transhumanists. And different transhumanists may have different visions of how technology will end up improving the human condition. So some transhumanists may indeed be focused more on cybernetic types of enhancements. Some may be interested in mind uploading, but I would say the majority are interested in predominantly biological life extension, because that is the most proximately attainable method.
Right.
It's also the method that I think can most reliably preserve the individual without discontinuities. So if you have mind uploading, there are a lot of philosophical questions about whether that will preserve the original self or just create a copy. And one can speak for hours on that particular subject. Right. Likewise, with any artificial types of enhancements, be they organs or artificial neurons, hypothetically in the future, the question is, how do you integrate them into the organism so that one can directly experience the world through them the way that one directly experiences the world through one's biological components. Again, I don't think it's an unattainable type of future. I think there is no inherent reason why a mechanistic type of enhancement couldn't be fully integrated into the body. But again, the prospects for that may be a bit farther off than biological life extension.
I think
In
there's also
the article, you sent us an article that was a chapter of your book, the Handbook of Transhumanism, I believe it was titled. And in that article, you referred to transhumanism as the philosophy that to go beyond the human in the sense of overcoming today's fundamental constraints of material scarcity, disease, decay, death, and zero-sum conflict. And that sounds to me like transhumanism exists on a kind of continuum where you're gradually getting rid of the problems that face humanity. Is that how you kind of conceive of it? Like, even in the beginning of humanity, we would build tools to make life easier and make hunting easier and, reduce scarcity. So are you seeing this as like a continuum towards the end of these things, or is it just going to keep continuing and continuing, but we might never really actually get rid of everything?
I think it will be an ever continuing process because further improvement is always possible. And you're correct that there was, at the very least, a proto-transhumanist spirit in every technological innovator. Human beings, as part of their human nature, have the tendency to seek to overcome their limitations. So when hunter-gatherers mastered fire, and fire ceased to be just a menace that could randomly flare up and endanger the habitat of these early humans, fire now became a potential ally, a potential tool that could be used. And that transformed a lot of societies. Any technology that we use that gives us fundamentally different and new capabilities could be thought of as transhumanists. So for people who have poor eyesight when unaided, if they wear eyeglasses or contact lenses, they're able to engage with the world more fully. They're able to take part in activities that would have been completely out of reach to them. That is a kind of transhumanist enhancement. But of course, the current generation of technologies and prior generations of technologies could only take us so far. And we do live a lot longer than our ancestors did. Most people in the Western world today, and especially in countries like Japan or South Korea, which have even outpaced the Western world here, can expect to live into their 80s, whereas most hunter-gatherers had about an even chance of dying before their 20th birthday. So we're already a lot farther along than our ancestors were, but we are on the cusp of certain breakthroughs that could remove some of these stubborn limitations that have still accompanied us to this day, despite our progress. And the finitude of human lifespans is the greatest of those limitations, but there are various others. For instance, cancer has been a very stubborn kind of ailment, in particular because it's not one disease, it's many, many different diseases, each of which requires an individualized approach to mitigate and eliminate. But also what you cited from my chapter in the Transhumanism Handbook, the susceptibility to material scarcity, which gives rise to this very toxic zero-sum thinking that has pervaded a lot of human societies, where a lot of people would say, well, there's only so much to go around, so let's have our group appropriate it all and leave nothing for the other groups. Whereas in reality, because of technology, because of the potential for innovation, it should be possible to create enough resources that all of these conflicts would be completely unnecessary, and it would be much more productive for people to cooperate and exchange and seek to grow the metaphorical pie rather than to wonder how do we divide the existing pie. So if we can have a world of sustainable superabundance where there is more than enough to fulfill everybody's conceivable material needs and wants, we will see the vast majority of conflict just completely disappear. Now, it may take time for ideology and culture to adjust, which is why we need philosophy and we need advocacy of transhumanism to illustrate these possibilities. But if you look at human history and you consider how riddled with these kinds of conflicts born out of scarcity our history has been, and you consider what are some of the possibilities for technology to solve that, that will create a fundamentally different human condition. I think one much more aligned with the recognition in objectivism that there is no conflict among people's rational self-interests.
I get that, and I appreciate that. I mean, in some ways, I mean, I'm very anti-left. I'm just, you know, I just see it as a religion. And in some ways, it's become like this post-Christian religion, just about, you know, using altruism to pass things out themselves and create heaven on earth. But within that, you know, and I mean, I was very excited to see that there are Christian transhumanists, and I a little bit surprised to see socialist transhumanists. I know, you know, some of them are in the party, some of them you're friends with, and I get that. I mean, even though as anti-socialist as I am, I call it Scottsdale, where I say, you know, look, if you socialists will, you know, just hold off on the socialism for now until we solve the diseases of aging, then we'll, you know, go along with starting to spread things around. Then, you know, it takes forever to pay for socialism, then we'll have forever. But, you know, so, but I want you to help, like, with either the party platform where they're talking about universal basic income. I mean, I understand the end of scarcity and growing the pie. I'm not sure the socialists understand that and appreciate it.
Yes, and I think you made an important point. We are a big tent, and as long as people are aligned with the goals of improving the human condition through science and technology, we accept members from a wide variety of backgrounds, be they religious or non-religious, be they libertarian or socialist or objectivist or Democrat or Republican or centrist or apolitical. Essentially, we try to elicit the best in people. And if they're willing to help us with achieving that future of radical abundance, then we will have all the time in the world afterward to debate political systems and institutional systems. So the question is, would a person's efforts be taking us in the right direction? And I would say life extension advocacy is crucial for that. So if they want people to live longer, then they're helping us to obtain that additional time when we could engage in more refined consideration of political and other institutional systems. Now, in terms of the sequence of events, yes, in my view, having socialism right now would be disastrous, and it would essentially halt the progress of technology in similar ways to what has happened in other socialist countries,
Sure.
in the sense that those socialist countries, they might have been able to mobilize resources for a time to achieve industrialization or achieve a space program as they did in the Soviet Union, using the technologies that were already available and using a lot of very poorly compensated human labor. But innovation of a groundbreaking sort, of a paradigm shifting sort, is essentially impossible in a command and control type of setting. You need free, creative individuals who expect some sort of reward for their work and can be reasonably assured of getting that reward and not being sent to a concentration camp in order for these kinds of breakthroughs to happen. But I think a lot of socialist transhumanists, first of all, their transhumanism leads their worldview to be a great improvement over just the conventional socialists
Absolutely.
who just
Of
want
all
to
the
redistribute.
socialists, yeah, of all the socialists, I'll trust the transhumanists first.
Yes, because they see a potential for growing the pie. And then perhaps their idea of socialism is more of the end state that Karl Marx anticipated, where essentially, in Marx's view, even government would not be necessary once the problems of production and distribution have been solved. Then it's interesting because the end state envisioned by Marx is one where every individual would have the freedom to just be fully creative and in control of his time and dedicating that time to autonomous productive achievement without material scarcity being in the way. So I don't fault anybody for having that kind of end goal. I think the means that a lot of socialists propose toward reaching that goal are completely flawed and counterproductive, and history has shown that they're flawed and counterproductive. But I would also point out that in the 21st century, the kinds of economic questions and systems that we're going to be dealing with are very difficult to portray as either capitalism or socialism. It seems both of those terms are predicated on a certain level of technological and economic advancement. And outside of that context, they don't really make sense, because right now in the United States, we definitely have markets, we definitely have a lot of trade, we have a lot of private enterprise. But is it really a capitalist system, or is it more of a kind of mixed economy system where it's very difficult to draw the boundary between private enterprise and government? Consider
That's
the revolving
true.
door. And there are so many people who premise their entire lives on the idea that they'll work in a private sector for a while, but they'll use that as a way to get into a government position where their goal isn't to be purely a civil servant, but to help a particular regulated industry, this is called regulatory capture, get certain policy changes or process changes enacted. And in return, there's an implicit understanding that they'll be richly rewarded with some favorable position in that industry after they move on from their government position. Is that capitalism? Well, some have described it as crony capitalism, but there's another potential set of considerations. So a lot of goods and services now are essentially free, and free not in any sort of manner that could be associated with piracy, but legitimately free. You can get a lot of free music online that the creators want you to download or to stream. You can get email for free. You can get social media for free. And granted, there are business models associated with it, but it's not the old model of you giving money in exchange for goods or services. Likewise, a concept like universal basic income does not have to involve taxation or compulsory resource extraction in any way. The way the United States Transhumanist Party advocates for universal basic income to come about is through what we call the federal land dividend. So right now, the US federal government owns vast amounts of completely unused land. In the state of Nevada, for instance, about 85% of the land is owned by the federal government. And yes, some of it is leased already, but the vast majority of it is just completely unoccupied. Nobody is using it. People could be using it for productive purposes. So what if we have a dramatic opening of this federal land to leases by private corporations, and those private corporations would be earning a profit on leasing that land, and the rent that they pay to the federal government would be used to facilitate a universal basic income. And along with that, there could be cost savings because many existing welfare programs, which are conditional, and sometimes the bureaucracy involved in making sure the recipients meet those conditions is the biggest source of expense for those programs. Those programs could be phased out and replaced by an unconditional basic income, which would be less expensive to administer, more generous, and more importantly, it wouldn't be seen as a redistribution of wealth because everybody would be entitled to it, from the wealthiest billionaire to a homeless person on the street. And the reason to do that wouldn't be to enact any sort of class warfare, quite the contrary. It would be to prevent major social upheaval if certain segments of the population feel that they're so disadvantaged that they have no opportunities whatsoever, rightly or wrongly. We may see some very destructive behavior. We have seen some very destructive behavior in the various riots that we observed in 2020. So we have been thinking a lot in the Transhumanist Party about how to prevent that without raising taxes on anybody, without imposing restrictions on economic development, but rather using the assets and resources that are currently just completely unutilized and directing them toward enabling people to have this basic standard of living, which wouldn't preclude them from earning additional income. And more importantly, it wouldn't disappear if they earned additional income. Right now, the problem with welfare as currently constituted is if you receive unemployment assistance and then you find a job and it's a fairly low paying job, all of your welfare assistance goes away and you don't really have an incentive to look for those lower paying jobs. But with a universal basic income, anything you earn in addition to the UBI, you get to keep. So even if you have a minimum wage job, or if you make a little bit of money as an independent contractor, that's all yours. And you have an incentive to develop yourself in those realms and remain productive within the broader economy. So,
And the eco-socialists in the party are going to go along with selling large swaths of the West to corporate development?
well, I think, first of all, there aren't that many of those kinds of eco-socialists. There are several kinds of environmentalists, and I think you've hit on the distinction between what we would call the dark green environmentalists, the kind of deep ecologists who think humanity is a blight on the earth and needs to dramatically scale back, and
Right.
then the bright green environmentalists, the ones who see future technologies and the greater application of current technologies as a way out. So let's say we have some bright green environmentalists who think we should be using more alternative energy sources as a way of solving the problem of climate change. Well, one promising alternative energy source is solar power, and solar power is becoming competitive with fossil fuels right now from a pure cost-based perspective. But we need a lot more land for solar arrays. So we have a lot of unused federal land out in the West. If a private company were to build solar arrays there and earn revenue from doing that and pay rent to the federal government, and that could be used as universal basic income, it could also fulfill some of the environmental objectives, even of the people you would call eco-socialists. And really, I've noticed this in recent years. The vast majority of proposals for technological developments of this sort in hitherto uninhabited land, they tend to have at least components of them that emphasize clean energy, that emphasize environmental stewardship, that emphasize essentially fewer undesirable byproducts of human activity than existed before. And this comes from a purely capitalist frame of mind in terms of these kinds of ideas and approaches also providing more of positive public relations to these entities, so they can say that they're helping solve these kinds of problems with smart cities, for example. So I think even in terms of kind of environmental outlook, the only way to address environmental problems is through the progress of science and technology. One can't go backwards and burn wood and dung as they do in certain parts of Africa today still, because that pollutes a lot more than coal or natural gas. So hopefully people will recognize that increasingly, and I think transhumanist messaging can certainly aid in that recognition.
Yeah.
Gennady,
Sure.
let me give you my take on universal basic income, because I am not a fan of it. I think that the problem with UBI is that, at least the way it's proposed, is that it's unconditional, untargeted. It's basically just a blanket distribution for everybody. And I think that sounds more like a socialist type of policy rather than a welfare type of policy, because welfare is targeted to people who need it. So if there was such a thing as UBI, I'd like to see it be targeted to the people who actually need that income for some, actual disability or problem or reason why they can't work. What do you make of that? Or, what is your thought on that?
Well, actually, it was Karl Marx who said, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. And there is a problem with that. And one of the problems is that it tends to lead to the inflation of at least demonstrated need or people making the case that they have certain needs. But another problem is you need a bureaucracy to administer that system and validate that people have those needs. So if you have a need-based system, either it gets blown completely out of proportion and everybody asserts some sort of need, some sort of hardship or disability in order to get a portion of that resource allocation, or you need very strict criteria and you need armies of officials essentially making sure that this person is actively looking for work, this person isn't using this money to buy drugs or alcohol, this person is following whatever checklist of steps is considered to be important in at least theoretically getting that person out of this predicament of dependency. But as we know with these welfare programs, it seldom actually works. Even though there are job training programs, there are very rigorous procedures that people have to submit to in order to check in, let the caseworker know what they're doing, maintain their eligibility. In practice, it doesn't really improve people's circumstances because it's all for show. It's all for getting through the hoops in the system. And I think everybody knows that that's the case. But it's really expensive. If you consider how much money the US federal government and state governments spend on this system of administration and oversight, you could very readily give more than $20,000 a year to every American for that kind of expenditure. And it would be a lot more effective because there wouldn't be the disincentive built in. So if you have a need-based system and your need disappears because you've improved your situation, well, you stop getting the aid. So that perpetuates the incentive for people to stay on the dole, so to speak. But if you have an unconditional system, then no matter what you do, you get that basic payment, whatever it is, and it doesn't have to even be necessarily equivalent to a living wage or anything like that. So Alaska, which doesn't have a reputation for being a welfare state, has its permanent fund based on oil revenues that accrue to the state. And every year, every citizen of Alaska gets a payment ranging from a few $100s to about $2,000 to $3,000 at most, which is that citizen's share of the oil revenues of the state of Alaska. Nobody has really complained about this, and nobody has been thrown into a state of perpetual dependency because of this. So it's a supplement to their incomes, but everybody who receives it still goes to work, still tries to find other ways to sustain him or herself. And I see the universal basic income for most people working in a similar way, in that instead of being a kind of reactive system that responds to a need and fulfills it, this may prevent certain kinds of needs from arising, the ones that are due to, let's say, chronic poverty and dependency. If people don't have incentives anymore to portray themselves as chronically poor or dependent, whether or not they are in practice, but they have an incentive to just accumulate resources from whatever source and improve their situations, I think you'll find that the vast majority of UBI recipients, they're going to want to have jobs, they're going to want to be self-sustaining to the level that they absolutely can be. And to the extent that this money goes to fulfill their basic needs,
They've done experiments in certain areas where they've given UBI. I mean, has it been shown that the recipients have been more creative? Or, I mean, I care more than the moral, just about the practical. Is it going to make these people more into the life extension movement and someone that can contribute to it? And, you know, then we can work out the morality after that.
Right. There have been some limited experiments in Canada, even going back to the 1970s, in Finland, in a few other countries. And the experiments have shown, now keep in mind, these were fairly short duration trials, a year or a few years at most. They've shown that there was no disincentive from the UBI to seeking employment or doing any sort of other productive tasks. And that generally speaking, the money was spent on very understandable life improvements, paying the bills, making certain home improvements that most people would recognize to be common sense. So taking off some of that burden that people experience when they're chronically in debt or living paycheck to paycheck, leading to more breathing room, in essence, for people to develop themselves and improve themselves. Now, another important aspect to recognize is that most of those trials, they were actually targeted toward certain segments of the population, people with lower incomes or people who were identified as having some sort of material need. So these weren't, strictly speaking, universal basic income programs. They were more akin to welfare with fewer conditions than would be typical. But still, even with those caveats, those kinds of payments from the experiments that I'm aware of, did not inhibit people's motivations. People didn't quit their jobs. They didn't stop trying to educate themselves or maintain their homes, for instance, just because they were receiving that money.
Beyond UBI, what about things like the scientific establishment and the abuses we've seen with COVID and Fauci? I mean, is it because I think that you guys support the scientific establishment, but in some ways, I almost see that we need more of a disruptor kind of approach, just because the scientific establishment is sometimes more keen on shutting out dissenting views than a true search for the truth.
There are certainly issues with the scientific establishment. I think it's important to distinguish the actual scientific research from the institutional pressures that could lead to, let's say, certain areas of research being underemphasized, or let's say improperly interpreted. There is a lot of the publish or perish pressure in academia. Peer review based institutions, they tend to be a lot more cautious in terms of considering new ideas. And so you could have a promising new idea, but if the majority of the rest of the scientific community just isn't ready for it, is overly skeptical, it could take a long time for it to percolate through the institutions. There are some issues with government bodies that provide grants to researchers being hyper cautious because they have to be accountable to taxpayers and politicians. And so a lot of the advances in life extension, they rely on experiments that may or may not work out. Each experiment has a great deal of risk built into it from the standpoint of perhaps the ideas being explored not leading to breakthroughs every single time, but that's the scientific process. Science involves trial and error, and if you don't allow room for the error, then you won't have the substantive breakthroughs either.
Right.
But a very small proportion of the grant applications, less than 1/5 of the grant applications to the National Institutes of Health actually get funded for that reason. And this does distort the incentives of researchers, because if they want to get that 1/5 of the grants, the way they would do that is by phrasing their application in very timid, cautious, unambitious ways that the grant giving body could say, okay, this is likely to succeed. We can safely allocate taxpayer money to it without being scrutinized later on for having been allegedly wasting that money. So I think the problems with contemporary scientific institutions paradoxically stem from too much accountability, too much of a potential for some other person or entity to second guess or veto the decisions of somebody who wants to take on an ambitious experiment. Now, that's not to say that the government institutions are the only ones that have problems. There are incentive problems in the private sector right now as well that scientists like Aubrey de Grey have commented on in depth. And these are incentive problems arising out of short-term orientations. And understandably, a private investor wants a profit and wants a reliable way to profit if possible. And that's fine for most areas of business where you can focus on the next quarter's earnings, and if you have an immediate revenue stream, you can focus on growing that revenue stream and earning a profit. But for biotechnology especially, the timeframes along which a particular idea matures into technologies that can actually be used in patients, those timeframes could take decades. And many investors just don't have that time horizon. And they generally come in when a technology is already mature enough that there are some immediate potentials for earning revenue. So one needs something in between the basic research, which often does get funded through government or academia, and then the immediate application of existing knowledge, which often can be scaled fairly well through private investments. There's this middle area, sometimes called the valley of death, where a lot of promising ideas don't make it through that stage of gradual but necessary buildup from idea to application. That's where philanthropy needs to come in. And private philanthropy, of course, is the way to go, because governmental institutions are subject to the crisis of excessive accountability that I mentioned. But a private donor is accountable essentially only to his conscience. So if a private donor sees something as being promising in the long-term future, and if that person wants to live longer, that person might decide, well, it's worthwhile to make a monetary contribution in the hopes that this will eventually materialize.
Sure.
Regarding government financing of science, I believe it was Eric Weinstein who's really against, or maybe it might be Eric Weinstein who's railing against government financing of science, and he wants more private money involved in scientific research. And one of the issues they brought up was the research on telomeres in mice. And I think the problem had something to do with them using lab mice instead of just natural mice from the wild. This was causing some corruption or problem with the research. Maybe you know more about it, but I know telomeres is an important aspect of curing senescence, or like aging. And if that view is based on the research done on mice, that seems to be a real problem, because then we can't trust the research. So what are your thoughts on this angle and the telomere issue in mice?
So one of my good friends and a strong supporter of the Transhumanist Party is Dr. Bill Andrews of Sierra Sciences, who is perhaps the foremost telomere biologist in the world. And essentially all of his research has not focused on mice, but has rather focused on the potential for various substances to induce telomerase and lengthen telomeres in humans. So not all of this research is oriented toward mice. I think he will be one of the first people to point out a lot of the differences between humans and other organisms, including the fact that mice do not die from telomere shortening. It's interesting, actually. He and I have had these conversations, and some of them have been recorded as part of my earlier Enlightenment salons that were recorded in my house in 2018. But we will be having him on again on October 10th. So tomorrow, compared to when this interview is being recorded on my YouTube channel, which is G. Stolyarov II. And we will be discussing some of these aspects of aging and how aging differs between humans and other animals. But one of the main points that he has made is humans do age in part because of telomere shortening, and mice do not. So having experiments on mice is not going to give us the information we directly need to address human aging. But more generally, there has been a problematic tendency with certain mouse experiments to use mice that essentially were specially engineered to have a particular kind of problem, and then a particular regimen or substance is used to remove that problem, which means the genetically engineered mice become a bit more like normal mice. But I think a more reliable approach would be indeed to take what we would consider normal mice, the kinds of mice we would find in the wild, that haven't been engineered to have a particular defect, and then show how a given treatment or regimen could improve the health of those mice and the longevity of those mice. Another problem with a lot of mouse experiments is that they have a cutoff in time. So unfortunately, there's a lot of waste in animal experiments in the labs where there are completely terrible protocols that sometimes require killing the animals at the end of the experiment, even if they survive, which is, again, quite counterproductive if you want to measure longevity. Because if you want to measure longevity, you want to keep those mice around for as long as possible and see how long they could hold out. So I would say the experiments that we should really pay attention to that could tell us something useful about how to remedy aging are those experiments that use mice which have not been altered in any sort of adverse way, which haven't been given any disease conditions. And also experiments that don't involve killing the mice at the end, that actually take the time to wait until the mice expire of whatever causes they would expire of, and see what that means. We still haven't broken the 5-year barrier in terms of mouse lifespans. The mice that almost reached the 5-year barrier were genetically engineered dwarf mice in the early 2000s. They were created by Dr. Andrei Bartke, one of the recipients of the Methuselah Mouse Prize. But seriously, we need more mice like that. If you have engineered mice, engineer them to have positive attributes that enable them to live longer and see how long they can live.
Good. And by the way, your show is the Transhumanist Salon is on YouTube every Sunday, 4 p.m. Eastern, I think. I've caught a couple of those. They're good. I want to switch gears a little bit to talking about life extension as a cultural force. And I think, the party does that to some extent. To me, getting into Ayn Rand, I mean, when she talked about the morality of life, with life being the standard of morality, that just became, that's when I kind of put it together that, humanity is meant to solve this issue. Rand talked about how values are that which one acts to gain or keep. But what I've observed is there's a whole different mindset when you're in growth mode versus keep mode, or playing not to lose. And I think that to some extent has happened to society, that we've taken care of the basics of survival, and without a higher purpose, that's why, even if it wasn't socialism or Islamism, something else would come along to be like a new purpose for everybody to get into. And I used to think life extension would be a nice goal for people to get together on. But now I'm convinced it's the only way to get people back into growth mode, to have something aspirational again, like in the big growth days of the 19th and 20th centuries, so that we don't have to go into a new dark ages. I think this is what Rand fans should unite around. And I'm just curious of your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think this is an important point. And you have alluded to the crisis of meaning that has existed in a lot of Western societies during the postmodern era, precisely because postmodernism rejected the prior sources of meaning that motivated people. The most powerful of those sources of meaning came from the earlier modern paradigm, and that was the confidence in material progress. And it seems that when that confidence was eroded during the mid-20th century, in part because of the consequences of the world wars, and in part because of the bad philosophy that came in reaction to that, then a lot of people became aimless. And although technology continued to progress and to give people a level of material comfort, for the people who were aimless, that just enabled them to entertain some very counterproductive ways of thinking and acting. So how do we restore that sense of meaning? Indeed, I think transhumanism offers the most efficacious way to do that, because yes, we can have a lot more progress, a lot more improvement to the length of our lives and the quality of our lives. I would say the everyday comfort that a lot of people in the Western world experience is unfortunately largely an illusion, in that, yes, you can probably spend a given day without being attacked by a predator or attacked by someone on the streets, but we're all still so fragile, so vulnerable to diseases, to accidents, to larger scale deleterious effects, to natural disasters, for example. We had a vast smoke inundation in northern Nevada from the California wildfires about 1.5 months ago, which led the air in the entire area to become hazardous for certain days. And when you're in a situation where you're surrounded by hazardous air, all of a sudden, all the other material comforts become a bit less relevant, I would say. And people don't realize how vulnerable we are still to that. They're often lulled into a false sense of security simply because most of them don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. But there's still so much suffering that can be alleviated for all of us. And the only way to really do that effectively is to push outward the bounds of technological progress. So by illustrating that this is possible, this is achievable within our lifetimes, transhumanism can imbue people with a new sense of meaning. And I agree, the goal of radical life extension is the most important, the most noble goal that we could be pursuing, especially because those of us who are alive today are on the cusp between being the last generation to die and the first generation potentially to live indefinitely. So for people who understand the significance of that, that should be a tremendous motivator and a call to action.
Absolutely. So I come from a religious background. I grew up as a Protestant, thinking that God existed, and I was wondering like how to lead a good life and what would happen after I died. So I see what's happening as we're transitioning from this cultural purpose of a religious immortality or achieving an afterlife religiously with God, and we're transitioning from that to a more scientific approach where we're going to just extend our life here on Earth. But it's still basically the same human purpose, which is to extend life and to keep living. But before science, they didn't know how to heal yourself. I mean, in fact, Jesus came on the scene as a healer. He would heal people, go around healing people. And that's kind of also in line with the view of humanity's purpose as, extending life. But of course, that was based on miracles. And now we have science. So I think that what's happening is we're trying to figure out how to achieve that old religious purpose in a secular scientific way.
Yes, and I think that old religious purpose was quite noble and still it is, healing the sick, helping people overcome suffering and misery, overcoming death. All of these are very understandable and deeply ingrained motivations for anybody who wants to solve problems. Historically, humans have been very limited in what they could actually do to solve those problems. And I think that's where most theologies arose, positing some sort of continued existence after death. But it's interesting to consider that Christian theology, per my understanding, doesn't actually say that there is another kind of spirit world that somebody will inhabit. A strict reading of what the resurrection would be, according to Christian theology, would posit a physical resurrection in the flesh. And it's interesting how this aligns too with some proto-transhumanist thinking. There was a school of thought called the Russian cosmists in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the Russian cosmists actually posited that it was the common task of mankind not only to overcome death and disease, but eventually to figure out technological means to revive people who had already died. And this would be essentially the manifestation of the resurrection. And I bring this up because I think religious interpretations very often themselves are responses to the possibilities that are present in the material world in a given era. So religions evolve as well. And in the Transhumanist Party, we welcome people of all religions. We don't try to deconvert people, but we do encourage them to think about how to align or reconcile their theological beliefs with the possibilities that the science makes available. So if it does become possible to revive people in the future who had already died, for instance, people who enter into cryonic suspension, then this would be a kind of resurrection that is more realistic than having a disembodied spiritual afterlife. But some people, especially in the future, might say, well, this is what their religions had taught all along. There's no conflict there. And if that's what they believe, I, as an atheist, still welcome that, because they are allies in helping to bring these kinds of advancements about.
Absolutely. People
Also
just-
interesting that in the Old Testament, people lived for hundreds of years. So it's like Noah was like 900 years old or something. So it's kind of, I guess there's a sense that before sin or wrongdoing entered the world, people had a longer life, and life was, basically eternal. So I don't know what to make of that, but you mentioned other examples of where religion kind of follows or predicted what we're doing now, I guess, in a sense that they had the same goals. And so just that example of the early people in the Bible living longer is essentially the goal, I guess, of what that we're seeking now, is just to live hundreds of years.
Yes, and I think it's helpful for people who believe in that to point it out to them that their own holy texts posit cases of individuals whom they revere, at least in many cases, who did achieve these kinds of extraordinary lifespans. There's an organization, one of the most prominent life extension charities, called the Methuselah Foundation. And according to the book of Genesis, Methuselah lived for 969 years. And the goal of that foundation is to contribute to enough cures for diseases and rejuvenation treatments that eventually we humans would be able to live that long. But the biblical Methuselah was the inspiration for the name. And also studies have found that whether or not a person is religious doesn't really have a statistically significant effect on whether that person is inclined to accept radical life extension or the technologies that would bring it about. So a religious person who is sympathetic toward those technologies would be able to find theological reasons to accept them, as would a non-religious person. But people who have an aversion to those technologies, that aversion doesn't stem from their stated religious or philosophical beliefs. It's more of a disposition of character, I would say. So some people are more mired in status quo bias than others. They find it more difficult to envision life and the possibilities available to them being dramatically different in the future from what they are today, even though the scope of those possibilities has already changed many times over throughout human history. So I would say there is more of a problem with limited imagination and a kind of fearful desire to remain in the moment, especially if one is experiencing some illusion of comfort, and how to get people to break free of that illusory status quo bias. That is the major challenge of life extension advocacy.
It's like being a life insurance salesman. You got to tell them you're going to die if you don't do anything. And, you know, I think that a lot of it, what I've experienced is there are people that they don't want to admit that it's a noble goal because it means admitting you've wasted years of your life already without more consciously pursuing things that would help extend your life. And maybe, you know, just making sure the party is, you know, welcoming and doesn't appear to be like judgmental. I don't think that you guys are, but it just, you know, also just, I mean, you're the whole package. You're fit, you run. I mean, one thing that held me back years ago is people saying, well, I can't, you know, you can't promote life extension because you're not in good enough shape. And it's like, there's this End Aging Now group on Facebook that is, you know, they say, we're interested in life extending technologies, not about, you know, nutritional information or exercise. And it's an important distinction just because there are people that, you know, they just in terms of feeling like they can advocate for it.
Yes, I think anybody can become an advocate for indefinite life extension and should become an advocate for indefinite life extension. And also anybody can take steps to incrementally improve their health and quality of life. As a runner, I always like to encourage people to do what they can in that realm, even if that means they can only run a mile or run and partially walk a mile. That's how I started as well. Now I started doing that 21 years ago, but still when I began, it was a gradual process of building up that kind of endurance. And for anybody in the beginning stages, they might think, well, they have a long way to go. There are people who are more capable of it. But if you do something, that's better than doing nothing. And doing something makes an incremental contribution to one's health. And doing it successfully, of course, provides motivation for further improvement. And likewise with advocacy, I think anybody can start on a small scale, having a conversation, writing a post, linking to an article, joining the US Transhumanist Party, which is absolutely free to do at transhumanist-party.org/membership. We definitely are not going to look at what state of health you're in right now. We don't have that litmus test. We don't have an ideological litmus test in the sense that you can be an objectivist, or as we've discussed, you could be a socialist or anything in between. We do have our 3 core ideals that we display in our membership application. They're very concise, and we ask if you agree with those core ideals. Those core ideals are support for significant life extension through the progress of science and technology, support for creating a rational political, cultural, and societal atmosphere that is premised on reason, technology, and secular values, and then support for using science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate the existential risks facing the human species. So these are fairly broad statements that I think people of a wide variety of backgrounds and life circumstances can agree on. And whatever one's situation is as an individual, if you want to be part of our movement, if you want to take the steps forward to help humankind get to those goals, I think your presence would be quite welcome. Even though I am an individualist, and quite strongly so, I will say we're all in this together in the sense of having this common task to overcome the problems that plague us all, and certainly vulnerabilities to disease and death are issues that we all have to face and overcome.
Can you address one issue I have, which is the liberty issue? Because I think that since there's some socialist elements that that could be embraced to promote life extension, such as NIH doling out resources to scientists, and government welfare programs, maybe like UBI. Do you see a conflict between having a government that protects rights and liberty versus a government that promotes life extension?
I don't see a conflict, because ultimately, in order to get to that kind of purely limited government whose only role is to protect rights and liberty, no matter what scenario we can conceive of, it will be a gradual transition. And even Ayn Rand recognized this. She wrote that, for instance, she doesn't like taxation. She thinks all taxation should be voluntary, but she recognizes that any time in the next few decades from when she was writing this, it would be practically infeasible to just get rid of taxation altogether. So she was more focused on where the tax money was being spent. And likewise, I think it's important to consider, if we have in the status quo a government that is definitely far from the kind of limited government that objectivists would want, there are still better and worse ways for that government to be spending its resources. And I would say, all things considered, activities like those of the NIH or the proposed ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, which is supposed to be the analog of DARPA, are much more productive than the vast majority of government spending today, including on the welfare programs or the overseas military interventions, which have been completely wasteful in many cases. So there is a difference of degree. But moreover, in those specific areas that advance life extension, there is essentially no coercion or compulsion involved. So the NIH is not like the CDC. The CDC can impose various restrictions on individuals, as we've seen during the pandemic, and that can be quite controversial to a person who values human liberty. Certainly, I am no supporter of the lockdowns that occurred early on in the pandemic. I think it was a foolish decision to impose them.
Right. I mean, some of it's contextual. It's like,
right,
if they had said that it's because life extension is around the corner and solving the disease of aging, maybe I'd have been okay with a 2-week lockdown.
Right, right. And I do agree, it is contextual. And I will also say, when there were lockdowns, I personally complied with them, not because I agreed with them, but because, well, I wasn't too eager to expose myself to an unknown virus either. So I think a lot of the same effects of social distancing and physical distancing could have been achieved through voluntary means. And likewise, I am fully vaccinated. I have worn masks before I became vaccinated. I still wear them because of the mask mandates, even though I think the vaccinations are a lot more effective than the masks for those who are fully vaccinated. But I can comply with this voluntarily without needing to be coerced or threatened into doing so. And I think many people can. But the NIH doesn't have the ability even to do that. They essentially fund research, and that research doesn't limit anybody's freedom. There are some issues in terms of, as I mentioned, the incentives regarding what sort of research gets funded. Right. So I don't think the NIH alone is going to solve the aging problem by any stretch of the imagination. You need the private investment, you need the philanthropic contributions, you need a vibrant startup ecosystem in order to have these breakthroughs actually occur. But also from an individual liberty aspect, the choice to take advantage of these medical advances will entirely be up to the individual. So the US Transhumanist Party strongly supports the individual's right to choose to accept or not accept a medical treatment. If some people don't want to take advantage of an experimental therapy, they don't have to. And at the end, I think there will be a spectrum of adoption of technologies. Just like today, the Amish exist and the Amish reject a lot of technologies that have been developed since the 19th century. But interestingly enough, they don't reject contemporary medicine. They still go to hospitals to treat serious conditions. And I think it is within the rights of each person to be selective about what technologies they accept. They may accept some types of treatments and not others. There will be diversity in that regard. And so I think the pursuit of life extension is very much compatible with individual freedom. And within the current system of a highly interventionist government, it's also compatible with a trajectory that over time rolls back the power of that government, even as it remains involved with funding certain research or providing a universal basic income.
Yeah, just getting back to the cultural stuff for a moment. I mean, there's part of it that I just feel like needs to be turned into a moral crusade, almost with like a preacher's cadence. I went to synagogue at age 12 for prep for my bar mitzvah. I was already doubting my faith by that time, but I'd hear them emotionally chant, praise God, giver of eternal life. And even then I was thinking, if you believe in that, you need to have much more passion for that being that is saving you. In some ways, I always had a little more respect for these crazy religious barkers on the street in the 80s. I mean, at least they have the passion of their beliefs. So, I mean, a lot of us are so logical and intellectual. And sometimes I think we forget this is something we really need to be amped up about, especially if we're on the verge of solving the diseases of aging.
And there are people in the longevity community, certainly, who hold those views as well. We had a virtual enlightenment salon with Gary Abramson, who is a graphic designer and also one of the leading advocates in our movement. He talked about the importance of inspiration, about reaching people not just through rational arguments, but also through vivid imagery and stories and illustrating the wonderful possibilities that
Right.
a future of radical life extension could hold. There's also the Coalition for Radical Life Extension, which puts on RADFest. RAD stands for Revolution Against Aging and Death. It is an annual life extension conference. I've attended it every year that it has been offered, and that has been for the past 6 years. The past 2 years were virtual, but RADFest very much works on the model of combining the scientific presentations with inspiration and entertainment and motivational speeches from some of the activists in the movement. And I would say it's a very unusual combination, but it has worked well in terms of getting people to connect with one another and to meet other enthusiastic life extension supporters and form possibilities for future collaboration. So there's definitely a lot of room in that. I would say there's room for a variety of approaches depending on whom one is trying to reach. So
Sure.
if one is trying to reach another researcher, the best approach, I think, is a very cerebral, dispassionate one that tries to objectively consider the evidence and show to that researcher that, yes, these ideas are feasible, they're within the realm of scientific discourse. On the other hand, if you're talking to a person on the street, yes, having more of an inspirational angle to one's approach, I think will work better. And it also should be custom tailored to the individual, trying to understand what motivates a particular person. And if there are sources of reluctance or resistance, where are they coming from? And what are some of the most effective ways to overcome that? It's not guaranteed to work in every case, but it works better than a one-size-fits-all type of approach.
Yeah.
Do you see transhumanism as primarily a cultural / philosophy movement, or is it primarily, a political type of movement? And I ask that because, like, if objectivists were to get together and form a political party, I don't think they'd have socialists in that party. It would be a capitalist party. But transhumanism has a broader tent, as you say, and you focus more on the philosophy, I think, but then you call yourself a political movement. So I'm just wondering, how do you see yourself, in that light?
Yes, and we are definitely a broader tent than an objectivist party would be. What we focus on in the political context is policy rather than politics as conventionally defined. So politics as conventionally defined has essentially become a team sport, my team versus your team, looking at personality traits of candidates, very often being very rancorous and oppositional. We look at policy from the standpoint of what are the best possibilities for solving problems, for improving the human condition, especially in the intermediate to long term, in ways that can get the interests of as many people as possible to align. So we actually don't want to be just another faction in the political fray. And I think this is what distinguishes us from an organization like the Libertarian Party. So I am sympathetic to a lot of figures within the Libertarian Party, by the way, but the Libertarian Party, I think, is still too restrictive in what it's able and willing to consider, because we do live in a highly turbulent, uncertain, ever-changing world, but also a world where technology continues to open up new possibilities. And we have to be really creative in terms of considering what policies can address that effectively, and how can we do that in a way that doesn't trigger what I call the trench warfare issues, or what some others might call the wedge issues of politics. Examples of those, most prominently in the United States, are abortion and gun control. A lot of people have very fixed and firm positions on those issues. And it's not necessarily the case that it had to be that way. It just happened to become that way because of historical path dependency and the major political parties exploiting both of the, let's say, mainstream sides of those issues in order to get people to become really passionate about matters that most likely would not affect them personally. And that passion is then used for people to self-select into demographics that tend to favor either the Republicans or the Democrats. So we want to steer clear of that in the Transhumanist Party. And to the extent that there are any genuine social problems, we want to consider how can those problems actually be solved. So a position on an issue should not, in our view, serve as a tribal signaling mechanism, that you're part of the red tribe or the blue tribe or any other tribe. Rather, people should genuinely and thoughtfully explore, if there's a problem, how can we overcome it? And how can we do that in a way that respects the rights and interests of as many people as possible? So that's what differentiates the Transhumanist Party from all of the other political parties. If we encounter an issue and we look at policy solutions, our first thought isn't going to be, well, is this capitalist or is this socialist? Does this idea align better with the Republicans or the Democrats or the Libertarians? That really is at most an afterthought in our view. The primary thought is, will this solution actually work in addressing the problem effectively? And if so, how can we make it work for as many people as possible?
That's good.
You mentioned abortion. I imagine that's a tough issue to deal with for any political party, since you want to bring in as many people as possible, and people are so that people have so many battles over the issue of abortion. But
yes,
it also abortion does deal with life. So, and your party's interested in life extension. So do you have a policy about abortion?
So our position on abortion is that with the current level of technology, there is an irreconcilable conflict among legitimate interests in that, yes, a woman should have a right to her own body and determine what to do with it, but also the fetus, past at least a certain stage of development, is a human life form, and we should at least want to preserve that life form. So how to resolve that conflict? In our view, the only way is through technology, and in particular, the technology of ectogenesis, artificial wombs. So let's say that in the future, a woman wants to end a pregnancy, that's her right. But instead of killing the fetus would be relocated to an artificial womb where that fetus could develop into a viable, autonomous human being. And then there might be a question of, well, who gets custody of that child? Will it be a ward of the state? But those questions exist today. There are people today who are in need of adoption. And I think it could be handled through the institutions, hopefully improved institutions of that time. But getting rid of that conflict, I think, is a technological means rather than a matter of one side or the other of the current controversy prevailing. because there really is no sustainable solution to the abortion issue today. But with artificial wombs, I think that's going to revolutionize that entire field and make it a lot more feasible to have clean solutions that respect everybody's rights.
Technology may solve a lot of our existing issues, even if it creates some new ones. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I think the work that you're doing is crucial. Just going back to something you've said that dovetails with something I've said for years, the future will separate history into the time that death was inevitable and the time that it changed and thereafter. And from that perspective, I think that you are probably going to play a role in the history books, especially when everyone has forever to search. So thank you for all the work you're doing, and please just keep on doing what you're doing.
Yes, thank you very much, Scott and William. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you.
Great. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schuff, along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.